Hi, welcome to the second clip of this week's lecture on the concept of society, perhaps one of the most fundamental concepts that anthropologists deal with. And for some anthropologists, namely the ones that we'll be examining today, it is absolutely the foundational concept of the whole discipline, hence the name social anthropology, as I said in the previous clip. In what I want to do in this clip is really introduce you to the core idea and the core kind of agenda of this approach to doing anthropology before, in following clips, we look a little bit at the history of its development. So what is the core idea of an approach based on the concept of society in anthropology? Well, put very, very simply, it is the idea that society is a thing. It has its own existence. And it is powerful. It has power over people. And the example that I would use in order to just convey this idea in the most simple way to you would be a lot easier to use if we were all in the same room rather than you watching me in this clip. But imagine that we were all in the same room and ask yourself, if you looked around, what would you see in that room? You'd see me. You'd see my lectern. I would see you, you'd see each other, you'd see your desks, you'd see the walls of the room and so on, the floor. All of these things exist, right? But as far as the idea of society is concerned, the idea is that there's more to that room than what you see with your naked eye, so to speak, because in that room, there are also these things that Durkheim, as we'll see in the next clip, the father of sociology, as he's often referred to, called social facts. So society consists of a whole bunch of stuff that is just as real as my body, yours, my shirt, the one that you see here, the lectern or the desks in that room that we're imagining. Things like values, institutions, customs, rules and laws, language, habits, meanings, trends. All of these things are social and they have a massive influence on our lives. In fact, they define the very coordinates through which our lives are lived. So, for example, casting our mind back into that imaginary lecture theatre in which we can't be, the fact that you are sitting down, imagine that, you're all sitting down, and I'm standing behind the lectern or probably pacing up and down in the front of the room, is an expression of the fact that I occupy the social role of your teacher or lecturer, and you occupy the social role of student, right? So the role of the student in the situation of this socially defined occasion that is a lecture is to sit down quietly and listen attentively to a lecturer who's pacing up and down in the front of the room, usually standing up, right? The convention of putting a hand up to ask a question is also a social convention, right? So social facts, values, institutions, customs, and so on are operating on us inside that room and can be studied as such. They are not visible in the same way that my body is or my shirt is, but they are perceptible in the way that they influence our behavior and make our behavior social. So those are the core kind of tenets of this approach in anthropology. Social facts exist. They can be studied as such. Indeed, the study that is devoted to the study of social facts is indeed, or of society, is the discipline of sociology. Social anthropology is another discipline that is closely allied, according to this approach, with the discipline of sociology, and other social sciences as well are devoted to studying social facts, according to this approach. And these social facts, as I said, exert power over people, and referring to the way in which social facts exert power over people allows sociologists, social anthropologists, and other social scientists to advance explanations of human behavior. So that's really the core idea of this approach. So let me translate this into essentially the agenda of an approach based on the idea of society in anthropology. What kinds of things are anthropologists who have focused on society interested in, right? So I've got this slide here, which you can study in your own time more closely, but broadly speaking, This approach is one that is interested in describing and charting out social structures, trends, and forces. Often you'll find that people who take this approach seek to combine quantitative with qualitative methods. So you might want to describe people's experience of, say, being a student, to go to our previous example, and part of your description might be an account of the statistics involved in how many people go into higher education today in the UK, for example. That would be a relevant social fact, a social trend, for example, right? And you might combine that with more qualitative kinds of materials, for example, asking questions about what it is subjectively like to experience being a student, what people call in university lingo the student experience. You might want to study that qualitatively. That's also a social fact, right? Now, you describe and chart these social facts and you explore the correlations between them, right? It's almost like, think of it a little bit like a kind of social physics, right? You've got this factor and that trend. How do we connect those forces, trends, structures? How do we see the ways in which they influence each other and generate particular forms of social behavior, right? And by exploring these correlations, the ambition is to advance an explanation of social behaviors. Right? Social facts are real and have a causal power over us, right? The way that we behave is causally related to our social positioning, social dynamics, social structures, social trends, and the job of the anthropologist who studies these things is to establish these correlations in order to advance explanations of them, of these behaviors, right? And these explanations can also be cast in a comparative way. We can compare how different societies or different social groups operate and advance differential explanations that are comparative in their nature. Here things operate in that way, elsewhere things operate in a different way. Right? And finally, part of the agenda is to muster these explanations to advance theories about the distinctive ways in which the social, the societal, has a causal influence on the way that people operate, right? So imagine the social anthropologist interested in society as being in the business of developing a theory of how the social is important in understanding human behavior, alongside, say, the biological or the sociological, or the psychological aspects of our behavior. So this all translates into a series of core questions that an anthropologist who takes this approach might be interested in asking. Typical questions that people ask in this neck of the woods of anthropology is, what are the structures and dynamics in any given social group? How do the various dimensions of society, its structures, its values, its rules, its meanings, how does all this stuff hang together? How do individuals get socialized into these groups, structures, right? So this idea of the individual that comes in, is born into social facts is a really important question for these approaches. So how do I get brought into, for example, the values that underpin being a university lecturer, right? How do I get, that's the word that I was looking for, how do I get socialized into these structures and values and meanings is a question that is really live for this approach to anthropology, right? Also, how do these things change over time, right? How do social structures, institutions, and so on reproduce themselves over time, right? People are born, mature, grow up, grow old, and die, right? But institutions perdure through time, right? So think of UCL, for example. UCL is an institution that's been with us since the beginning of the 19th century. We're all passing through it, right? But UCL remains, but it also changes over time. How do we understand that? What is normal and what is pathological in any given society, right? What kinds of behavior are sanctioned socially and what kinds of behavior are deemed to be transgressive? And how do such transgressions sometimes have a reciprocal effect on the social structures that they overstep and change those structures? That's another interesting kind of question. How do societies change? But the ultimate premise that I want to leave you with in this clip that really underpins all of these questions is this idea that I mentioned at the very beginning, that society is a realm of existence in its own right. It has its own life, right? Society is, we'll talk about this more in the next clip, it's a kind of superorganism, if you like, that lives above us as individual biological and psychological organisms and operates upon us. We're all subject to its forces, to its powers. And the job of the sociologist and the social anthropologist is really to explain how all of that works. Okay, so that's what I had to say for this clip. See you in the next one, where we'll talk a little bit more about the history of this idea, and particularly its origins in the thinking of Emile Durkheim, who is a really crucial figure in all of this.